What if I told you that while the West is literally tearing itself apart from inside, one man is quietly redrawing the map of global power, and most people have no idea it is even happening? Right now, as you are watching this, the world order that has dominated international politics for decades is shifting beneath our feet. And at the center of it all, standing at the United Nations podium with a message that is resonating across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East, is President Xi Jinping. This is not just another diplomatic speech. This is a calculated power play that could change everything. And if you stick around for the next few minutes, I promise you, by the end of this video, you will see global politics in a completely different light. So before we dive in, do me a huge favor. Smash that like button, subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this. Trust me, this is the kind of stuff that does not make it to your regular news feed. Let us get into it. Now, to understand what Xi Jinping is doing at the United Nations, you first have to understand context. Because this is not happening in a vacuum. The world in 2025 and going into 2026 is a mess. And I do not mean that in a casual, oh things are a little rough kind of way. I mean the global order as we have known it since the end of World War II is under serious strain. Let me paint the picture for you. On one side, you have the Western Alliance, NATO, the European Union, the so-called rules-based international order, and it is cracking. Not from the outside, not from some external enemy, but from within. The United States, the very country that built this system, is now the one shaking its foundations. President Trump came back into office in January 2025 with a trade war playbook that sent shockwaves across the entire planet. We are talking about tariffs on China that at one point reached 145%. We are talking about tariffs on European allies, on Canada, on Mexico. He even threatened military action against Denmark over Greenland. Denmark, a NATO ally. Let that sink in. And here is where it gets really wild. In February 2026, the United States Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the president cannot use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose tariffs. That is the legal foundation that was being used for most of these trade measures. So now you have a constitutional crisis layered on top of a trade war, layered on top of diplomatic ruptures with America's own allies. It is chaos. Meanwhile, in Europe, the fractures are deepening every single day. NATO held a summit in The Hague in June 2025, and on the surface, everything looked great. 32 member nations pledged to raise defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. Sounds impressive, right? But here is what they did not tell you in the headlines. Spain tried to block the entire agreement. Hungary's Viktor Orbán continues to play footsie with Moscow. The Eastern European countries, Poland, the Baltics, Romania, they see Russia as an existential threat and are spending like their survival depends on it, because it does. But Western European nations like Italy and Spain, they are dragging their feet. They do not feel the same urgency. And that gap, that disconnect between how different NATO members perceive the threat, is a fracture line that is only getting wider. And here is the kicker. The United States itself is pulling back. In late 2025, Washington announced it would not replace an infantry brigade stationed in Romania after it rotates out. That is the beginning of a military pullback from Europe. America is shifting its focus to the Indo-Pacific, to the Western Hemisphere, and Europe is being told, hey, figure out yourselves. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is calling it NATO 3.0. The Americans are calling it a necessary rebalancing. The Europeans, they are calling it a crisis of trust. French President Macron has been particularly vocal, saying that France now provides the majority of intelligence support to Ukraine because the Americans have been unreliable. Think about that. A core NATO ally is publicly saying they cannot count on Washington anymore. And it is in this exact environment, this moment of Western confusion, division, and self-inflicted wounds, that Xi Jinping steps up to the microphone at the United Nations. Now, what does he say? Well, if you have been paying attention to Chinese diplomacy over the past few years, the themes will sound familiar, but the timing and the context make them land completely differently in 2025 and 2026. Xi Jinping's core message at the UN revolves around one big idea: multilateralism. But not just any multilateralism. What he calls true multilateralism, which is China's way of saying the current system was designed by the West, for the West, and it is time for the rest of the world to have an equal seat at the table. He talks about the UN-centered international system. He talks about respecting the sovereignty of nations. He talks about non-interference in other countries' internal affairs. He pushes for reforming the UN Security Council to give developing nations more representation. He advocates for reforming the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to reflect the actual balance of economic power in the world today, not the balance from 1945. And he wraps it all up in this beautiful, poetic language about building a community with a shared future for humanity. It sounds idealistic. It sounds like something you would put on a poster. But make no mistake, there is a razor-sharp strategic calculation behind every single word. Because here is what Xi Jinping is really doing. He is positioning China as the alternative. While the United States is slapping tariffs on its own allies, while NATO members are bickering over who is going to pay for what, while Europe cannot even agree on how to support Ukraine, Xi Jinping is out there saying to the global South, to Africa, to Southeast Asia, to Latin America, to the Middle East, hey, we hear you. We respect you. And we are ready to work with you as equals. Not as a superpower dictating terms, but as a partner. And folks, it is working. Let me give you the numbers, because the numbers tell the story better than any speech ever could. BRICS, the bloc that started with just Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has now expanded to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, and it has 10 partner countries waiting in the wings, including Nigeria, Turkey, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Together, BRICS nations now represent over half of the world's population, nearly 30% of global GDP, and more than 50% of global economic growth. In 2022, BRICS overtook the G7 in terms of share of global GDP measured by purchasing power parity. By 2024, BRICS was at 35%, the G7 at 30%. By 2040, projections show BRICS plus at 45% versus just 21% for the G7. Those are staggering numbers. And is not just about economics. China, through the Belt and Road Initiative, has invested over $1 trillion across more than 150 countries. They are building ports, railways, highways, fiber optic networks, power plants, smart cities. They are connecting continents. While the West talks about infrastructure, China builds it. They launched the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, the Digital Silk Road, and BRICS Pay, which is designed to help countries trade in their own currencies instead of relying on the US dollar. This is not just aid. This is the construction of an entirely parallel global economic system. Now, let me give you the trade war context, because this is where things get really interesting. Despite facing tariffs from the United States that at one point reached 145%, China ended 2025 with a trade surplus of nearly $1.2 trillion. Let me say that again. $1.2 trillion. Chinese exports rose by 5.5% in 2025 to a total of $3.77 trillion. How did they do it? Simple. They pivoted. When the American market got too expensive because of tariffs, Chinese companies redirected to Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe. China now accounts for only 7% of U.S. imports, down from over 20% before Trump's first tariffs in 2018. But China's overall trade is bigger than ever. They did not shrink. They diversified. And that diversification is exactly what Xi Jinping's UN speeches are about. Building a world where China does not need any single market to thrive. Now, here is where we need to have an honest conversation. Because I know some of you are thinking, okay, but is this all just propaganda? Is Xi Jinping just saying nice things at the UN while doing the opposite? And look, that is a fair question. Critics point to China's behavior in the South China Sea, where they have been building military installations on disputed islands. They point to human rights concerns. They point to the Belt and Road Initiative saddling some countries with unsustainable debt. These are legitimate criticisms, and we should not ignore them. But here is what I want you to understand. Every major power in history has had a gap between its rhetoric and its actions. The United States talks about democracy and freedom while supporting authoritarian regimes when it suits its interests. European nations talk about human rights while their companies extract resources from Africa with minimal benefit to local populations. The truth is, geopolitics is not a morality play. It is a chess game. And right now, Xi Jinping is playing chess while the West is playing checkers. Think about what happened at the climate summit. Xi Jinping delivered remarks in April 2025 at the leaders' meeting on climate and the just transition, and he said something that really stuck with me. He said, however the world may change, China will not slow down its climate actions, will not reduce its support for international cooperation, and will not cease its efforts to build a community with a shared future for mankind. Now, whether you believe him or not, compare that message with what is happening in the West. The U.S. pulled back on climate commitments. European nations are struggling to balance green transition with economic pressures. China, meanwhile, has built the world's largest and fastest-growing renewable energy system, the largest and most complete new energy industrial chain, and has contributed a quarter of the world's newly added area of reforestation. They are the world's largest emitter, yes, but they are also the world's largest investor in green technology. That duality is uncomfortable, but it is the reality. And then there is the diplomatic game. In his 2026 New Year message, Xi Jinping said, and I am paraphrasing here, the world is undergoing both changes and turbulence. Some regions are still engulfed in war, but China always stands on the right side of history and is ready to work with all countries to advance world peace and development. That same week, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang, he made his first overseas trip of the year to Africa, continuing a 36-year tradition. She spoke with Brazilian President Lula about strengthening ties with Latin America and the Caribbean. He designated 2026 and 2027 as China-Russia years of education with Vladimir Putin. He is everywhere. Every continent, every region, building relationships while the West retreats inward. At the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Plus meeting in September 2025, she laid out a 5-point plan for improving global governance. Practice multilateralism. Advocate a people-centered approach. Focus on real actions, not just words. Oppose hegemonism and power politics. And expand cooperation with other multilateral institutions like the UN, ASEAN, and the Eurasian Economic Union. This is not just talk. The SCO itself has grown into one of the largest regional organizations in the world, representing roughly 40% of the global population. And here is what really worries the strategic thinkers in Washington and Brussels. India just took over the BRICS presidency for 2026. India, the world's most populous country, a democracy, a nation that maintains strong ties with both the West and the East. Prime Minister Modi proposed redefining BRICS as building resilience and innovation for cooperation and sustainability. He called for reforming global institutions to reflect 21st century realities, including greater representation for the global South. When even India, a country the U.S. has been courting as a counterbalance to China, is embracing the BRICS framework and calling for the same reforms Xi Jinping has been championing, that tells you something about the direction the world is heading. Now, I want to address something that does not get talked about enough: the emotional component of all this. When Xi Jinping stands at the United Nations and says that developing countries deserve equal representation, that their voices matter, that the international order should not be dictated by a handful of Western powers, that message resonates on a deeply personal level for billions of people. People in Nigeria who have watched Western companies extract their resources for decades. People in Indonesia who have seen trade rules written by countries they have never been to. People in Brazil who are tired of being told how to manage their own economy by institutions they feel do not represent them. Xi Jinping is tapping into a genuine frustration that exists across the global South, and he is offering an alternative narrative. Whether that alternative is genuinely better is a question that history will answer. But right now, in this moment, the appeal is undeniable. So where does this all lead? Let me give you my honest assessment. We are witnessing the most significant realignment of global power since the end of the Cold War. The Western-led order is not collapsing, but it is weakening. NATO is struggling with internal divisions. The European Union is trying to find its identity in a world where the U.S. can no longer be counted on as a reliable partner. The U.S. itself is consumed by domestic politics, trade wars, and constitutional battles over presidential authority. Meanwhile, China is playing the long game. They are building institutions, deepening relationships, investing in infrastructure, expanding BRICS, pushing for a multipolar world where no single country or bloc dominates. And the United Nations, the very institution that was created to maintain the post-World War II order, is becoming the stage where this transformation is playing out. Xi Jinping understands something fundamental about power. It is not just about military strength or economic size. It is about narrative. It is about who gets to define what the world should look like. And right now, while the West argues with itself, China is writing the next chapter. Will it succeed? Honestly, nobody knows. BRICS has its own internal contradictions. China and India are rivals as much as they are partners. The Belt and Road Initiative has left some countries struggling with debt. China's own economy faces challenges, from the property sector to consumer confidence. But what is clear is that the old order is changing, and Xi Jinping is doing everything in his power to make sure China is at the center of whatever comes next. So here's my question for you. Do you think the West can get its act together in time to respond? Or are we watching the beginning of a new era of Chinese global leadership? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to hear what you think about this. And if this video opened your eyes to something you had not considered before, please like it, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. We are covering these massive global shifts every single week, and trust me, you do not want to be the last one to know what is happening. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and I will see you in the next video.